Well, welcome, everybody. I am so excited to have Steph join us from New Zealand on the podcast today. Welcome, Steph.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
So, the reason I've invited Steph on the podcast is she sent me a beautiful email sharing that although she has two sons with autism spectrum, having done my online course, how much she learned, and very much that how I talk about every child's so different, how that really resonated with her. So, Steph, can you tell us a little bit about your sons?
Okay, so I have two adult sons on the spectrum and basically at opposite ends of the spectrum. So my oldest son was diagnosed as borderline Asperger's, and my youngest son, who's 3 years younger, was diagnosed severely autistic with a mild intellectual disability. So they were the total opposites.
Yeah.
One was really calm when he was younger, and the other one was absolutely dynamite. I used to say to people, he was destruction on two legs, basically.
Yeah. And that's really hard because if people have only had one experience, like one son who's really calm, that's all they know of the spectrum. But then if people have only known the dynamite end of the spectrum, that's all they know too. So you've got like the seesaw nearly of the two ends of the spectrum. Yeah. And
Yeah.
what ages were they diagnosed?
Okay, so my youngest son, Kieran, was diagnosed when he was 3.5. We started the process at about 3 years old. And my oldest son got diagnosed at about 7, and it wasn't really until my youngest son had been diagnosed and I was talking to one of the psychologists, and she said to me, well, usually if there's one, there's another. And she'd met my oldest son through primary school because she went there because he was in a class with a young lady who was being supported. And they had actually based a whole class around her. So they put kids who needed extra help in her class. And so the psychologist had been in there and she'd met my oldest son. And she said to me, oh, Steph, I think you might want to look into it. So I agreed especially after Kieran got diagnosed. So then Reeve was diagnosed with, as I said, he was borderline. So, as I said, opposite ends of the spectrum.
Yeah. So how old was Kieran when he got diagnosed?
So he was 3.5 when I got older.
The older boy, how old was he when he got?
Oh, he was 7.
7, which is the average age for diagnosis for children with that old Asperger's diagnosis. Like we don't use that term so much now. And as you know, in the course I talk about, I actually think that there's some people that still prefer that term and it resonates more with them. So that's still the average age, 7, of diagnosis. So, because of, as you say, it's borderline, isn't it? It's hard to pick.
Yeah. And it was funny because when Kieran was little, I mean, he's 21, 22 now. So when he was little, the developmental assessment program, he got onto it quite quickly. And so they were diagnosing apparently quite early. But my older son, as I said, because it wasn't obvious. He had more sensory issues, I think, rather than he certainly didn't really have the behavioural issues. So for me, and he also, what I didn't realise till about 4 years old, when he was at kindy, he actually had really, really bad eyesight. So this poor kid had been riding a tricycle with horrendous eyesight.
Oh.
And he used to fall over as a little 12-month-old, and he was trying to walk. So he'd spend a lot of time falling over, and I'd go and he'd watch TV and he'd be really close up, and I'd be thinking, oh, is this odd? And I saw other kids do this, so I didn't really think. And he was at kindy one day, and they had this long driveway, and he was standing at the fence waiting for me. And it wasn't until then his teacher realised, because she was standing with him, that he couldn't see me coming up the driveway until I was practically in front of him. And she thought, I think there might be something wrong with his eyesight. So he was 4 by the time he got diagnosed with that. The poor kid had been walking around with really bad eyesight for all this time, and I felt like a horrendous mother.
I was going to say mother's guilt. I think we were mother's guilt. It's fantastic. Okay, so thank you for just sharing a little bit about that. So why you emailed me and you said in your email, you don't know what you don't know until like that doing the course made you realize what you didn't know. What would be some of the things that you were like aha moments, if there was any of those?
There were actually plenty. It was like some of the references, like you talked about ODD,
Mm.
PDA. I heard those, but I had no idea what they were.
Yeah.
Talked about executive functioning. Now I'd come across it, but I had no idea what the term was again. And my biggest one that really set me off, I actually cried after that, is when you sat down and you were explaining like a sensory meltdown, a behavioural meltdown, and a tantrum, and the differences.
Yeah.
I'd spent years going through this, and when they were kids, it was in a time when my husband and I weren't married that long. We bought a house, so we had a mortgage, okay, not as big as today's mortgages, and we were on one income. And so we didn't have a computer or access to one. So there was a lot of things, and I became a computer illiterate because we didn't have one I didn't have one until about 8 years ago. And so there was a lot of stuff that I'd never come across, as in I didn't know the names for it.
Yeah. Well,
I had one features, but that you talk to them, but you don't always know what the questions to ask, if you know what I mean.
no, and Steph, as a teacher, I didn't learn any of this either. I've just worked it out along the way. And that's why I try and do that like step by step. And if you in the course start off with like really understanding autism spectrum and understanding the anxiety and so forth. And then at the end, because I think without all that prior knowledge about the stuff you talked about, then you can't differentiate between a sensory meltdown, a behavior meltdown, and a tantrum. And I think the way I stepped through it, no one ever taught me that. That was from working with a couple of thousand kids. So how can you as a parent be expected to know that? And I have teachers do my workshops every week who go, that was their favorite part too. Yeah.
It's just a really big moment when you realize you've been faced with all of them, but you had no idea that this had a name and these were the what happens when they have one of these meltdowns or tantrum.
Yeah.
And
people collapse. Yeah. Sorry, cracked up a little bit. But people collapse them too. And I think what I try and do is go, this is a sensory meltdown. This is what to do and why it works. This is a behavior meltdown. This is what to do and why it works. And then here's a tantrum, which fine, use your everyday parenting or school program, but don't confuse it with a meltdown. Whereas I suspect, like many parents I meet, like Anna Tallerman's, who I've done created courses with and written lots of books with, she went to positive parenting programs and kept failing them because they were teaching her neurotypical parenting, not neurodiverse parenting. And so she went, I think, 3 courses and just felt guilty and like a failure because they weren't covering meltdowns that related to her son, Daniel.
yeah, I totally understand that because you don't get taught it. A bit like you. So I have learnt things over the years as in trial and error and talking to other parents is what might be a good idea, what's a bad idea. And that's the way I learnt things. It wasn't, there's no handbook that said, oh, here's your child with autism. There you go. There's a handbook. This is how you deal with it. It just wasn't available. And as I said, we had no computer, so it's not like I could go and do courses and learn. So your course, when I came across your course, it was like something I'd wanted to do. I'd heard of you years ago and I'd heard of Dr. Tony Atwood. And it was like, now I've got the opportunity through circumstance to do it. And I thought, you know what? I don't know. I know Kieran's autism. I know it very, very well. I'm intimate with it, but I don't know much. So I wanted to learn. And it was like a lot of what you taught was like, wow, I never knew that had a name, or I never knew that could occur, or how do I differentiate between the two situations? So it was really, doing your course just was amazing. It just taught me so much. And I just, and I just want to carry on now. It's like, I've got that little bit, I want to know more.
Oh, I love that. And look, I really appreciate you sharing because I think what you're saying, and I think this is what teachers, educators, and parents who do my course say, they've experienced it but they don't know. Like a lot of parents, is this normal autism behavior or is this something different? Like I think what I do is like, you're like, well, I've seen this, but I don't know what to call it or what it is. And I think what I try and do is sort of give you that scaffolding and understanding about, okay, yes, this can happen for a child with autism, and I think in some ways it's validating, but I really like what you just said, that learning. And I really admire you have adult sons and you still want to learn and still want to know what's next. So I did say in an email, you said, what course should I do next? And I said, why don't we discuss it on the podcast? Because I think there's lots of people who've done my course and want to know what to do next, okay? So I thought we'd problem solve through it. So you just mentioned Tony Atwood. So Tony is a psychologist. So he does more what is the diagnostic criteria. I'm a teacher. I do more the what to do, if that makes sense. So I suspect a lot of the what is autism spectrum. But that being said, I mean, I still learn things from Tony because he shares lots of information in that as well. So that's that one. But have you heard of Temple Grandin?
Yes, she's very famous. Yeah. Learned about her very early on. Yeah.
Yeah. Because she was one of the frontiers, well, sort of first person to share about her own diagnosis and lived experience. In the course I did with her, she really talks about that, like her experience from being nonverbal to schooling. But what she goes on to really talk about is that getting jobs and employment too. Like she does that whole life spectrum, if that makes sense. And with if you were looking for something to support your sons, I think you'd have a lot of aha moments in the Temple Grandin course, because Temple really talks about like how to, it's based for teachers too, but how to extend and that loving push, really, which I'm sure you've had to do with your boys over the years. That how do you not push a child too hard, but give that loving support?
Yes, yes, exactly. With my younger son, he had a wonderful teacher in his last few years of school because he went to a special needs school, and he had the opportunity to stay at school till he's 21. And that I built, in saying that with every teacher he had throughout the years, I always tried to build that teacher-parent-teacher relationship, which was for the better outcomes of my son, to build those. And she knew exactly how to push him, but not push him too far. So she put him outside of his comfort zone, but it wasn't too far. So she always knew how far to push him and when to pull back. And an example of that was his school classroom was about 300 meters down the road from a dairy. And Kieran's currency, as I learned, that's a good word. I love that word for a child's currency. Kieran's currency was hot chips. So he could go to the dairy as an independent exercise to buy hot chips. And so this is what they used. And he also did other trips to the dairy for, like they did cooking. So he'd go and buy ingredients. So they used his currency as something to get him to learn a little bit of independence. But where we live now, I've moved from a bigger town, Hastings, to a small farming community. There isn't much options for him. So he was meant to do a life skills course through the local polytechnic. But of course, where I live now, it's impossible to get him there. So I decided that I'm going to teach him life skills. So that's what he's doing at the moment. He's learning life skills. He's learning how to cook. Or extending his cooking. He's learning what it means to keep a house clean, what's involved with being at home and doing household management, as we'll call it. So he's learning those things, because the options really aren't that broad here.
The same, Steph, the same in Australia, and many of my listeners who listen throughout the world would have the same experience, whether you're in a tiny regional town or anywhere. But what you're talking about with life skills, I mean, that's really why, like the photo cookbooks that I have and all of those things are all about teaching those life skills, because you can teach everything through cooking, from hygiene to cleaning, like just cooking, you have to clean up, all of those skills. And I'm a huge fan of that. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of schools in Australia now aren't allowed to teach cooking and life skills. Yet when I talk to families, that's what they want the most, So annoying.
Is that we, especially in Kieran's school, cooking was part of their curriculum. Cooking
Right.
is what they did. And even in mainstream school, when they get to high school, I'm not sure about primary and intermediate now. It used to be when I was at school, but that's many years ago. They still do cooking, which is grand because that, as you were saying, it helps in so many different areas like maths and hygiene and all sorts of things. So it was really good for Kieran. And they did, as you were talking about the books you've done, the cooking books with the pictures.
Yeah.
You need this, or you need X amount of flour, you need this, you need this, you need this. And so he actually built up his own little recipe book with very basic things that he could cook independently. And even now, his favorite thing that he can make on his own independently is he can get a potato, cut it up, and make chips. And then he can get a fish bites, and he knows how to cook them. So, it's building on those things.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, well, I think you would enjoy the Temple Grandin course. I think you have a lot of aha moments with that. And also because you want to go and work in schools now, I think you'd get a lot of good information because teacher assistants and education support staff have that same challenge. How hard do I push a child? How do I engage a child? Like you were talking about the currency. Well, Temple Grandin's really big on using the child's special interests and currencies to engage them and really coming from the child's motivation rather than you deciding what motivates them.
Exactly. Yeah. You got to find that currency. And that was Kieran's currency. It's you find the hot chips or the crisps and he's, you can get him to do whatever you want. Literally.
And aren't we all like that? Aren't we all like that? Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And the other thing Temple's really big on is teaching flexible thinking, which I suspect with Kieran, like, if something goes wrong, what are that being more flexible? Because for many people with autism, that can be so hard. And she gives some really good examples of how to be more flexible because with Kieran, I'm sure moving house was a big change for him. But also, if he runs out of potatoes, being flexible what he's going to cook or, and for many of our learners, that flexibility is really difficult and stressful.
It was for Kieran, and it still is. It's a learning curve for him to be flexible in different areas. Like if he has in his head that he might hear my other son and I talk about, because I separated from my husband, he might hear us talk about, we might have pizza tonight. Or for Kieran, that means we're having pizza.
Yeah.
But I said the word might.
Yeah.
In a sentence. So yeah, he's learning flexibility of what he thinks is going to happen to what is actually being said might happen, and it's a big might. So I always have to stress, Kieran, it may happen and it may not. You can't just get your head that it's going to happen because that isn't necessarily the case.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the one-track mind. And, in the course, when I talk about the word no can trigger a meltdown because it means never to a child, just your words matter. And we just say these words without thinking about it. But for your son, that's big anxiety and frustration that people don't say what they mean.
Exactly. And, your course taught me that I wasn't in many areas, I'm not specific enough. And you've got to be so specific when you want something. And I was thinking, well, why is this not working? I'm getting frustrated. He doesn't understand.
Yeah.
Why not? But, that was one of those aha moments. It's like, actually, I'm not being specific enough on what I want and what I'm saying. I'm telling him what needs to happen.
Exactly. And we think words like might are softer and kinder, but for someone on the spectrum, they're confusing, So, say what you mean. I love that. Now, you mentioned the PDA and ODD before, because I do also have a course called on pathological demand avoidance with Laura, who's like the world expert on that. But do you think either of your sons would be PDA or ODD?
I think that I'm not sure if they'd be PDA or ODD, but they have I think like with all autistic children, they sort of come across that they have bits of that, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
So it's another interesting thing to learn about because, that oppositional defiance disorder, I think we can all put our feet down and go, no, this isn't going to happen and I'm not having it. But is it actually ODD? Is it actually PDA?
Correct.
Not sure. So I'm thinking, just you saying that, I'm thinking actually maybe Temple Grandin's course sounds absolutely fascinating because it's Temple Grandin.
Yeah.
She would,
Well, perfect. Because I thought for a thank you for giving up your time to come on the podcast, I'd give you whichever course you were interested in. So you can have a think whether you want to do Tony, Temple, or the PDA. But I think they're the three, because there's like 9 courses to choose from. I know there's a lot, but I just thought, what better gift for having you can't give up your time and share what you got out of the course. So you can let me know later, because you might want to have a little read which ones. But I think you'd get a lot out of doing them next. So I hope that makes a difference to you and your boys and the children that you hopefully will work with in the future.
well, I hope to. As I say, at the moment, it's not a possibility. I have to be home for Kieran. And because we just moved here 11 months ago and I separated from my husband 20 months ago, it's those things that you got to sort of work through with the boys and they've got to settle. My oldest son has his job, part-time job, and that's okay. He's quite okay, but it was Kieran who had real difficulty moving here. He had real difficulty with the house that we lived in was the only house he ever knew. It was his home. We had his pets, leave those behind because this property isn't fenced properly. And it was funny because when I was looking for a house, I had to buy because moving Kieran once was hard enough. I couldn't imagine renting and having to move him multiple times. We were just going to run into all sorts of problems. So I had to buy. And we looked at different houses and Kieran goes, no, no, no. And so, because he had to be involved with where he was going to live and he had to be happy. Yeah. And we came to this particular house and we looked around and we walked out and my other son said to Kieran, and Kiers, what do you think of that one? He goes, oh, it's all right. What I hadn't realised is Kieran had spied the dairy 200 metres up the road. So that was the selling point for Kieran. It was the dairy up the road that sold hot chips. So now he can walk there and go and get his hot chips.
This is fantastic. I love, love, love that. Now, I just hearing that, I'm leaning towards you'll love the Temple Grandin course because her mum does so many things, especially with cattle. So I feel there's a synchronicity there. So, well, thank you for sharing and coming on and just sharing about that. And I get it's a really big life change for all of you at the moment and those baby steps. And as you say, involving the boys in the choices and making all those things that at the end of the day, though, you've got to be kind to yourself. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm like most parents. I'm my hardest critic. I know I'm not good at being nice to myself. I'm good at telling myself up or having a go at myself.
But then, I know, but you were so generous in your beautiful email you sent me. I got all teary when I sent your email about how amazing you are and the fact that you have 2 adult sons and you're still learning and want to help others. I just think give yourself a pat on the back. And I know we can all be hard on ourselves, but sometimes we've got to just go, actually, I'm doing the best I can. So I really, really appreciate you coming on and sending me such a beautiful email that made me teary. It was just so generous of you. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for having me on your podcast. Really appreciate it that I had the opportunity to talk about it.
It's so lovely. Well, I hope you have been enjoying this podcast and getting some great insights and understanding of a mum sharing really vulnerably all the things that being a parent of 2 boys with autism, what she's done over the years. I found it so interesting. If you are interested in doing my online on-demand course, which she has done, or the Temple Grandin course, there is going to be $50 off those courses this week. I know these courses will make a huge difference to you, just like they did to Steph. And if you have any questions or wanting to know what courses are for you, remember you can always email me. Make sure you subscribe to my e-newsletter so you can email me straight back if you have any questions. Or you can join me for the upcoming live virtual workshops on January 24th and February 5th. And you can watch at home, wherever you want, or with a group of colleagues. Don't forget to register ASAP so I can get your show bags out to you if you're in Australia. Look forward to seeing you soon at Live Virtual, or join my online on demand. And of course, if you do my online on demand courses, I'm always available for questions along the way to support you as on your learning journey.